My haunting experience started when I was working at a factory which would process plastics. It was a huge mill, 5 floors in total, and had a small team of staff on the night shifts. Around 4 people and a manager would be present. The first 2 floors would have all the processing machines, and the third and fourth would be for our stock, and the fifth was used to store loads of old machinery parts, which would get used for spare parts if or when machines would break down. So yes, after working at the place coming up to a year, I had heard all the rumors about the ghost on the 5th floor, but being the skeptic I was, I had just laughed it off and never gave it a second thought, although I must admit during some hours of the night when taking stock up to the higher floors you would always get that creepy feeling as though someone is watching you. During my time there I had never experienced anything like I did this certain night. The night shift had started like any other. We would all be in the locker rooms putting on our overalls and having a banter with the staff. The hours flew by quite quickly, and the manager Colin had asked if before my dinner break would I use the lift and bring down an extruder from 5th floor if he takes over in my machine. To which of course I said yes. Grabbing the pump truck I scooted over to the elevator, which is large in scale as it were used for industrial purposes. It had been used during World War II and was used for bringing down aircraft wings, which made it perfect for loading and unloading several tons of pallets of stock. As I got into the lift closing the shutter doors, I began pressing the button to go up and it didn't respond. I then began to press the other floor buttons. 4th no response, 3rd no response, and then finally 2nd, I heard the motors kicking in with a sudden jerk. It taken off. Once stopped at the 2nd floor I continued to press the button to go up further. It taken several attempts but finally it had moved again. This wasn't unknown to happen as the motors running the lift were always acting up. I then got to the 5th, proceeding with opening the shutter doors, and immediately got a cold draft right down my spine. Turning my top half of my body around to look, I remember thinking that they could be old windows cracked and maybe this is where the cold air is getting in. So dismissing it, I continued with looking around the floor, searching through old dusty pallets covered with plastic sheeting, lifting them up one after the other to look for the extruder. The further I got down the floor, nearing the end of the building, I finally found it. Taking my time to lift other equipment out the way with the electric pump truck, the minute I pulled it free the lights all went off. I done my best to carefully maneuver around the pallets and posts to make my way back to the lift in the dark. It came to a point where I could no longer see, so pulling out my phone to use as a torch I stepped off the truck to walk towards the stairs, which is where the light switches are, thinking maybe some eons come up and going to jump out to try scare me, as often we would play pranks on each other. So I went through the fire doors, hoovering my phone over the switches, all of which were already switched on. I flipped them up and down despite them already being turned on, popping my head through the doors to see if the lights had come on, which they did, somewhat flashing though. I went back to the truck and we got around the corner. Suddenly they had gone off again. Just out the corner of my eye I saw something moving. It was a womanly figure shrouded in a dark mist, hair blowing behind her shoulders, carrying something close to her chest. She was heading straight towards the lift, and with a screeching scream as she drifted hastily the second she got to the lift, it looked as though she had jumped facing down, as if the lift platform was not even there. Me being stunned, frozen on the spot by this, watching in horror, I made a run to the stairs, going down and down a floor each time, finally reaching the 1st floor to head straight to my machine for where the manager would be. Breathless I told him what I have saw. He found it somewhat of my imagination, but in despite of this he came to check it out with me, opening the 1st floor lift shutters, inspecting with a torch, looking down to the bottom and the top. Nothing there, he claimed. I stretched out looking with him and began protesting I know what I saw. He had then told me we can go up the stairs together, as the shutter doors on top floor had not been shut. So we can't call the lift down. So I again, trying to reassure him, I defiantly saw what looked to be a woman in the most raw-earthing scream, only the type to be heard in horror movies. Getting to the top floor once again, me cautiously walking over to where I had left the truck, pointing from where I had seen the figure appearing out of nowhere through stacks of heavy machinery parts in a straight line to the lift. Not fazed at all by this, went to the lift and said, "Okay, well, come on, we're waiting on the parts." I grabbed the truck and began to load it into the lift. Closed the shutter doors as I got in. On first press the lift activated perfectly and the whining of the motors was bringing us down the floors, and just passing in between the third and fourth floor the lift halted. Frantically pushing on the buttons again in an attempt to get it back moving. Wasn't impressed at all, as every second delay meant the machine I should have been running is left unattended. Then the lights began to blink, flashing on and off, eventually turning off completely. By this point was furious now that the thought had entered our heads, thinking the lift had broken down and we would be stuck between floors until someone could go right to the top of the floor and begin manually lowering the lift. He flicked the torch on, and with one quick beam of light it soon began flashing and powering off. He hit it with the palm of his hand in an attempt to get it to work. No joy. We was then startled by hearing a moaning like crying, sobbing coming from behind us. We both looked at each other with a somewhat of a puzzling look. Slowly we both turned around, and in the back corner of the lift was a black misted woman crouched on her knees. Her hands was covering her face. We both had our backs to the lift doors, scared out of our wits. The torch began flickering on and off. At a fast pace her head began looking up, with what appeared to be long dark hair covering her face. Within a matter of seconds the light went out and flashed back on. Soon as it did, the woman raced towards us like lightning, jaw wide open with no teeth and only dark spots for eyes, screeching a hollowing scream of rage right in front of us. She had shot right through us and through the lift doors, the lights then coming back on, torch and all. Then the motors for the lift kicked back in and began taking us back down. We both raced to open the doors the minute it had stopped. We both burst through the doors, scattering across the floor to run to other staff that would usually be in the brew room during the dinner hours. We spent a good hour calming ourselves down, repeating ourselves over and over again as each staff came and went from the room. Trevor, who had been the oldest and longest working staff member at the place, had eventually explained the history of the mill. It had been known that after the war it was reconverted back to a cotton mill, and women working here would be under a lot of stress to keep their job, especially now husbands were back from the war and work was scarce. There was one woman in particular that was said to have been raped up on the 5th floor on multiple occasions by a male staff worker. She lost her BF husband in the war and was desperately struggling to make ends meet. After she fell pregnant from one of her attacks, she gave birth to his child during a shift, but due to hospitals being out of reach and lack of transport, the female workers helped her have the birth. It is said she had summoned the strength to stand up, and without the protection of shutters at the lift, she held the baby in her arms and made a break to run straight to the lift, falling to her death as she did. The new rule was that on this date every year, no one would be allowed to use the lift and had to ensure that any stock or parts are to be readily available on the first floor for the night shift to start. Many new staff would come and go, all giving their stories on how they always felt uneased upon that 5th floor. Many of the regular staff point blank refused to risk going up there. I only stayed at the mill for a couple more years after the incident before finding myself a higher paid job. Still to this day it had changed me from being skeptic to opening my eyes, that the world has more to learn than we are led to believe.